The clink of silverware echoed softly through the small-town diner, but it wasn't enough to drown out the voice rising above the morning murmur. "You're a disgrace to real veterans," barked a younger man in a crisp jacket, eyes fixed on the elderly man hunched over his black coffee. The old man didn't flinch. His coat was faded, shoulders bent, hands trembling slightly as they held the mug close, like it was the only warmth in the world he could still trust. A hush settled over the room. No one defended him. No one challenged the insult. The younger man, full of stories and noise, smirked proudly, convinced he had just put the old man in his place. The elderly man stood quietly, adjusted his coat, and left a tip beside his half-eaten toast. He never looked up. The worn patch on his coat went unnoticed by all, faded, frayed, almost invisible. But it held a story heavier than the medals the loud man had framed on his office wall. What none of them knew, what not even the mayor or the veterans sitting nearby understood, was that this man had done things none of them would dare imagine. He had walked through fire and come out the other side, not seeking applause, but peace. And soon a general, someone who had seen the true cost of war, would walk into that same town. And when his eyes found that faded symbol, everything would change. In the quiet town of Maple Ridge, mornings arrived like memories. Slow, golden, full of routine. On Main Street, a small diner named Rosie's had stood for decades, its booth cushions worn smooth by years of elbows and whispered conversations. At precisely 7:15 every morning, a man named Walter Hayes entered through the jingling glass door. He never spoke much, just nodded at the waitress, took his usual seat by the window, and ordered black coffee with whole wheat toast, dry. He carried three things every day: a folded newspaper, a gold pocket watch that once belonged to his father, and a silence that filled the space around him like perfume. Walter was 82, though he moved like a man twice that age. His coat, a drab military green, looked like it had survived decades of storms and sun. Most people paid him no mind. Some figured he was just another quiet veteran holding on to old memories. Kids whispered that he might have been in a war, but no one asked. Adults speculated he lived alone, which he did in a White House, with a rusted gate and a perfect lawn. The patch on his left chest, barely visible, worn to the threads, was so faded it blended into the fabric. Most folks never noticed it, but every morning Rosie, the waitress, poured his coffee without being asked. Jake, the mechanic, offered him a ride home if rain was coming, and while no one really knew Walter's story, they all felt something when he walked in, like the air changed, like the past was sitting quietly at the corner table, asking nothing and offering everything. Then there was Rick Dalton, late 40s, ex-military, loud and proud. Rick had moved into Maple Ridge 3 years ago, with a chest full of certificates and a head full of war stories, none of which took place on any battlefield. He'd served 20 years, yes, but mostly behind a desk, supply logistics, base paperwork, reorganizing filing systems and running training schedules. Yet if you listened to Rick, you'd think he stormed Normandy single-handedly and made it back just in time to raise the flag at Iwo Jima. He strutted into Rosie's every morning like a man reporting for duty, polished boots, leather briefcase, military pins that caught the light just right, and he always talked loud enough for the whole room to hear. When I was at Fort Hood, he'd begin, launching into tales of administrative heroism and protocol mastery. Most of the regulars nodded politely, out of habit more than respect. But Rick had one habit that made people uncomfortable. He liked to single out Walter. He'd point at the man's coat, wrinkle his nose, and say things like, "A veteran ought to respect the uniform. That coat looks like it crawled out of a grave." Or, "Bet he never even saw real action, just wears that thing for attention." Walter never responded, not once. He just sipped his coffee and turned the page of his paper. Rick mistook that silence for weakness. He mistook Walter's humility for shame. And with every jab, every insult, every loud proclamation, Rick believed he was asserting dominance. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he was mocking a man whose service had earned the highest military honor this nation can give. But Walter never said a word, because real valor doesn't shout, it remembers. Veterans Day arrived with crisp wind and red, white, and blue banners strung across the streets. Maple Ridge held its ceremony in the town square, in front of the modest war memorial, a stone wall etched with names, a flag that never dipped, and benches donated by families who had sons that never came home. Folding chairs filled with townsfolk, children waving flags, a high school band warming up with squeaky trumpets. The mayor adjusted his tie. Rick was there early, of course, chest puffed, medals shining, hands ready to shake. Walter arrived without fanfare. No one noticed him take a seat in the last row, far corner, behind the maple tree where the leaves had just turned gold. His coat, the same as always. His presence quiet, his eyes soft but alert. The guest speaker that day was General Leonard Strauss, a four-star general, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, a man who'd seen both the Gulf and the grave. When he stepped up to the podium, applause filled the square. He began with the expected words, honor, sacrifice, memory. But halfway through, his voice paused. His eyes had locked on something, or someone. He set his speech aside. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice now carrying a different weight, there is someone among us who wears a symbol that should never be ignored. He stepped down from the stage and began walking toward the back. People turned. Murmurs rippled. The general stopped in front of Walter. He looked closely at the faded and straightened. This man wears the Medal of Honor, he said, the highest recognition of valor in the United States military. It is not given. It is earned in blood, fire, and sacrifice. Silence fell like snowfall. The general saluted. One by one, the townspeople rose. Some saluted, some held their hands to their hearts. Even the children stood still. Rick Dalton didn't move. He stood frozen, breath caught. Walter gave a small nod. Then he sat down again, calm as ever. But something had shifted. Respect, once forgotten, now flowed like a river through the crowd, and no one would ever look at him the same way again. Later that evening, the diner buzzed with stories, none from Walter's lips, but all from those who now saw him clearly. Rosie told of the night her water pipe burst, and Walter appeared with tools and fixed it without asking for a dime. Jake said Walter had once paid for a soldier's headstone in a nearby cemetery after learning the family couldn't afford it. Sarah, whose son had nearly drowned in a frozen pond 2 winters ago, recalled how Walter dove in without hesitation and pulled the boy out, coughing up ice but refusing help afterward. No one knew that Walter had once crawled through enemy fire in Southeast Asia to rescue 4 wounded soldiers, that he carried 1 man on his back for a mile through gunfire and jungle, that he refused evacuation until every last man was lifted, that he received the Medal of Honor not in a ceremony with lights and cameras, but quietly in a military hospital, bruised and broken, with more grief in his eyes than pride. He never framed it, never spoke of it, not even when pressed, because Walter believed the men who didn't come home were the real heroes. His patch, once bright with color, had dulled over the decades, just the way he liked it. He used his pension to fund the upkeep of the local Veterans Memorial, buying cleaning supplies, replacing bulbs, planting flowers. Every Saturday morning, he cleaned each photograph, dusted each plaque, wiped fingerprints from glass as if each name belonged to a brother. What Walter did was live honor quietly. While others chased applause, he tended to memory. While others told stories, truth. And until the general recognized the symbol on his coat, almost no one realized they'd been sitting in the presence of a man who had stared death in the face and walked away with silence as his shield. Rick Dalton didn't sleep that night. The general's words echoed in his skull like gunfire. Medal of Honor. He couldn't shake the image of that patch, or how the crowd had risen to their feet, eyes misted over, hands raised in a silent salute. He remembered every cruel comment he'd thrown at Walter, every joke, every smirk. Every morning he strutted into Rosie's thinking he was the center of gravity, while the true north sat quietly in the corner. The next day Rick arrived early. He took a table close to Walter's, something he'd never done before. The usual clatter of the cafe was muted. Conversation swirled, but Rick didn't speak. He just listened. Rosie poured Walter's coffee like always. Jake nodded toward the old man with new reverence. Sarah smiled softly and slid a folded newspaper to his table. Rick just watched, observed, understood. And then the whispers began. A boy had been saved from drowning. A cemetery was kept pristine by unseen hands. Flowers appeared at memorials with no explanation. The stories were real. They'd always been real. But Rick had been too loud, too self-important, too blind to see what was right in front of him. At 7:15, Walter walked in. Same coat, same stride, same quiet nod. He sat, opened his paper, and sipped his coffee. Rick didn't interrupt. He didn't boast or apologize, at least not yet, but he felt something crumble inside, something false giving way to something honest. And for the first time in years, Rick listened. Later that morning, Rick stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe, unsure what to do. His pride, once a fortress, now felt like a cage. He walked toward the town memorial, just to see it, just to understand. There he found Walter, kneeling before a plaque, gently dusting a photograph. His movements were slow, deliberate, sacred. Rick took a breath, stepped closer. "Walter," he said, voice low, "I came to ask for forgiveness." Walter didn't look up. He just handed Rick a clean cloth. "No need," he said simply. "Start on that side." And that was it. No lecture, no ceremony, just two men side by side wiping dust from memory, restoring dignity name by name. Rick worked until his knees ached, his hands raw, and with each picture he cleaned, a layer of arrogance fell away. Sometimes the greatest apology isn't spoken. It's shown in silence, in effort, in the quiet restoration of what we once ignored. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe humility, honor, and quiet courage still deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel. Share this video, because some heroes don't shout. They simply show up. And when the time comes, they remind the world what real greatness looks like.